Okay, so I will just start off with uh, the next one. Okay. Now, as the slide shows, the last few years have seen so many millions of people who are being forcibly displaced. And out of the 68.5 million, 25.4 million refugees are refugees. And then you have people who are internally displaced and people who are asylum seekers and so on. So, but this is a huge number which has not been seen since World War. And if you look at where these refugees and where they are coming from, majority of the refugees are in low and middle income countries. 85% are in low and middle income countries. And what is even more a cause for concern is that 52% of them are children below the age of 18 years. And we all know when children are exposed to trauma and violence when they are young, the consequences of that in the later life has so many psychological issues apart from suicide. And if we look at where these refugees are coming from, almost 70% of the refugees are coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. These 5 countries constitute almost 70% of the refugees. Okay, and if you look at Turkey, for this 4th year in succession, Turkey hosted the largest number of refugees worldwide with almost 3.5 million. And what is more heartbreaking is almost, I say it in lakhs, I do not know how to use it, 1,73,000 is 100,000, 73,000 are unaccompanied children. So if we look at the statistics from the year 2003 to 2017, you can see that from the year 2011, there has been a steady increase in the number of refugees. And as I said, if you look at where are these refugees going to, you'll find that in the top 10 countries, there is only one European country, that is Germany, which has significant number of refugees. No other countries no other European countries have that number of, is in the top 10 refugee hosting nations. As I said, for 4 years, Turkey, and before that 4 years, it was Pakistan. There was a lot of people, refugee coming from Afghanistan into Pakistan. But of late, actually in the last year, there are more refugees coming from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and that has seen a steep increase. And what happens? If you really look at it, this is the pattern of migration, okay? From Turkey on, from these 5 countries, they all go to Turkey. And from Turkey, they go. And you can see where the borders are, the red lines are the borders and the fences. So everywhere they are blocked, okay? And countries like Macedonia, which are very small countries, whose infrastructure is very, very little, or suddenly there is a huge influx of refugees and they don't know how to cope with it. So everywhere there are, and millions and millions and millions of dollars are being spent on building up these fences, for the border controls, for the law and order people, And if only 10% of those millions of euros or dollars are spent on the refugees themselves, the refugees would be in a far better situation than where they are now. And as I said, the Rohingya refugees are the latest in terms of thing, and many of them are housed in Bangladesh. They don't have a proper place. It is all mud walls with thatched roofs, and you all know how the monsoon is here, and we are dreading the monsoon because then they won't even have that mud walls and roof to cover. So this is happening not only in Europe. We know about a lot of people from Venezuela coming into the northern part of America. If you look at the difficulties of the refugees, there are three situations where they go through. The reason for which they become a refugee. They actually face war, imprisonment, trauma, violence, and all those factors. And then the process of becoming a refugee, the travel, the hazardous journey, and then they are separated from families. Some of the families are split, and the inhuman conditions which they go in the boats or in the trucks, or, and the fear of being apprehended and fear of death, that those are tremendous psychological pressure on the refugees. And then we have what is known as a post-location, the 6 Ds, where they are discriminated, they are dispersed because they are not in families, each person goes somewhere else. Then, for example, we know the islands in Australia where there is detention, then they become destitute, they have denial of work, denial of hygiene, and then they have a delayed decision about their refugee status. So all this causes huge issues. So when we want to study about suicide or attempted suicide in refugees, we are confronted with great problems in terms of data availability, accessibility, collection, and reporting. See, because it works both ways to collect data. The authorities in the hosting nations are very reluctant to give you statistics about suicide or attempted suicide because then that would reflect badly on them. And even the refugees, they don't want to report to the authorities or report to anybody about their suicidal thoughts or attempts because that would negate their chances of going to countries where it is possible or the fear of being repatriated. So it works both ways. So there is very little data on suicide. There may be data on mental health, depression, and all that. But when it comes to suicide and attempted suicide, neither the refugees nor the authorities want to collect it, want to act on it, or report on it. So it becomes a huge challenge. So we did a review of the number of, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. We did a review of all the studies which had some links about suicide and refugees. And we identified about 71 studies. And there was many of them are anecdotal reports or case reports. There were about 10 studies which had some prevalence, and there's only one intervention study about which I'll talk to you in detail. Though there have been some interventions in refugee camps in Uganda and other places for mental health for adolescents, but nothing specifically focused on suicide. But majority of the countries have developed some protocols on how to handle. I don't how much of it is actually done, we don't know. Now, if you look at the risk factors for suicide among the refugees, the age group we have found after the systematic review of the literature was the 25 to 40 years. And what is surprising is that unlike suicides in general, where men die more by suicide than women, amongst the refugees, it is the women who die more. And majority of them are single, and majority of them who have attempted suicide or died by suicide were quite educated, come from high socioeconomic status, and suddenly their status and education has no value. And then if you look at the psychological factors, we find that 9% of, there was a study, he did a study on the low and middle income countries, and he found PTSD in 9%. But of the people who had PTSD, 40% had made a suicide attempt. 29% had made a suicidal plan, and 31% had suicidal ideation. So, which is very significant. And it was found in 11% in children and adolescents, which again is very high when compared to the general population. So now we have the North Korean refugees which have come. And we find that in Korea, the North Korean refugees with suicidal ideation, the psychological factor which seems to be associated with suicidal ideation seems to be decreased family cohesion, self-esteem, and resilience, and a greater tendency to suppress the emotions and PTSD symptoms. So a mixture of suppressing your emotions and not seeking help and reduced family cohesion seems to be a major issue. I think you are more familiar with the Bhutanese refugees in the US. We find that, what is associated with suicidal ideation is the fact that you're not being a provider for the family. That seems to be the link between suicidal ideation and in the Bhutanese refugees in the US. And of course, decreased social support, and there are a lot of cultural context here and cultural issues. The man not being the provider, being the head, and he still holds a lot of what should I say, a lot of status, but finds that his status is being eroded, and so there is a tendency to be rule over the women without really being the head of the family. So these kind of conflicts are being formed. Now, if we look at the Thai Myanmar border, they looked at maternal mortality rate in refugees. Okay, between 18 and 36 years, the maternal mortality rate of refugees is 16.4, much higher than the rest of the countries. I mean, if you look at UK, the maternal mortality is only 0.8. And majority of the suicide happens between 18 and 36 years of age, between 9 and 30 weeks of pregnancy. So it is and it was studied what was the association with suicide and ideation. They found that those who have been exposed to intimate partner violence, there was significant. But when there was victimization and intimate partner violence, the percentage, almost 50% of women had suicidal ideation. But when there was no victimization, it was only 5%. So the combination of being a victim of an intimate partner violence is very, very high risk. Then we looked at when actually the suicide and suicide attempts occur. And we found that majority of the suicide attempts and suicide occur during the early period of being a refugee, which is in the first 6 months. And then the second most common period when suicide or attempt happens is when they have waited for a long time in a refugee camp or in an asylum or in a detention camp. When there is more than 1.5 years of being in a detention camp or an asylum, that was associated with suicide. The other time period when there was a rejection of their asylum status or when they are forced to repatriate, that also has an increased risk of suicide. And what is interesting actually, the fact that the kind of torture they had undergone seems to be linked to the method of suicide. For example, if somebody has been exposed to blunt force, they invariably use jumping. And somebody who has been tortured, water torture, they drown. And somebody who has been tortured with a sharp force, with some knife or something like that, they did stabbing and cutting method. So if you really look at all risk factors, you have the personal factors and the psychological factors. The pre-migration, they might have had difficulties before the migration, the post-migration difficulties, and all this, as I said, women, young, people who are educated, those are the people who are at a high risk. Now I'll talk about the study which I did in Tamil Nadu. This is India and Sri Lanka. Okay, the darkened portion of Sri Lanka is where majority of the Tamils live. And actually, I became interested in the concept of suicide among the refugees because of a personal experience. I practice as a psychiatrist in a community hospital in Chennai. And a young man who was about 23, 24 came to me feeling depressed and made a kind of a suicide attempt. And he was a Sri Lankan refugee. And I asked him, and if you look at the story, the Tamil Nadu government provides free education for all the refugees from Sri Lanka. It also gives them accommodation, free electricity, accommodation, and per monthly something. But they all have to stay in the refugee camp. A small percentage live outside, but they don't get the facility of free electricity, education, free health services, and free accommodation, and a monthly allowance. So majority choose to live in the refugee camps. And this young man was very bright. He came over when he was about 14, and he was bright student in Sri Lanka. He joined school here. He scored very well, and he got admission in one of our leading technology university called the Anna University, and finished with honors an engineering degree in computer science. All the rest of his classmates had campus placements and got off to a good job. But because he was a Sri Lankan refugee, he doesn't have a passport. He neither has a Sri Lankan passport nor does an Indian passport. So no company was willing to hire him. So after some time, a person who was having a small engineering workshop took him as an engineer. But the fact is, because they are all living in refugee camps, it's a kind of supposed to be a security threat because there are many LTT sympathizers in this camp. So if there is any movement of VIP or chief minister or anything coming up, they will not be allowed to move out of the refugee camp. They have to be there. So what happens? He had to apply leave repeatedly, suddenly. Even the small job which he got, he couldn't, they were not able to sustain. He was not able to sustain. So finally, this engineering graduate in computer science started working as a day laborer, as a painter. So naturally, he was depressed, and he came and told me, and he said, "Doctor, you're sitting in the nice consulting room and telling me what are all the things which I can do. You just come to our camp, then you will know what life is like. And I went to the camp and I found that majority of the men were in alcohol abuse and majority of the women were commercial sex workers. And the suicide and the suicide attempts were very, very high. Anyway, to give you a brief about the Sri Lankan refugees, there are about 100,000 Sri Lankan refugees living in Tamil Nadu, the state which I come from. And I say almost about 68 of them, 68,000 are living in these camps. There are about 110 camps, okay, with varying degrees from 200 people to more than 1,000 people. So we decided to do a study and we wanted to reduce the suicide and attempted suicide in these camps. So we originally thought we would do it in 2 interventions and keep the 2 camps as a control camp. But it was very hard to get any funding for trying to do a research in a refugee camp. So finally, we raised our own resources. We didn't get funding from anybody. So we raised our own resources and had 1 intervention camp and 1 control camp. And the intervention camp is called the Kottapad camp. And this is the camp which you can see. You know, small houses with thatched roofs, quite overcrowded, but you know, rent is free, electricity is free, so that's where they're here. So in the intervention camp, we wanted to raise awareness. So you know, we had what we call a street plays. Sorry, that is you just go in the open area and you know, talk about mental health issues and like a form of a street drama kind of a thing, so that people will become aware about that. So then what we did was we did a baseline survey of all the people both in the intervention camp and the control camp. There were 20 Sri Lankan camps with over 1,000 population. Okay, and we chose the Kottapattu as the intervention by lottery method and Thopukolai as a control. And we screened there were those below the age of 18 years we didn't take. Those above the 18 years, there were 899 people in the intervention camp and 856 in the control camp. And then we screened all these people. We screened about 639 in the intervention camp and 664 in the control camp. And we screened everybody with 4 instruments. The SNEHA to assess depression, then PTSD, then PHQ-9, and then previous suicide attempt. And those who scored over 16 in depression scale, those who scored over 30 in PTSD, those who have made previous suicide attempt, and those who scored high on the Beck suicidal intent scale, ideation scale, we classified them as high risk group. So we identified 288 in the intervention camp and 187 in the control camp. So this is the this is the study profile. Total population, those below 18, those numbers surveyed, and number identified as high risk. So what was the intervention? We had to think of something which is evidence-based, something which is very simple, something which really does not require a mental health professional, because you know, for a population of 1.3 billion in India, we have only about 6,000 psychiatrists. We have more Indian psychiatrists in the USA than in India, which is a sad state of affairs. So we have to think of an intervention which is simple, which is peer delivered, which is easily trainable, and So we term this intervention as CAS. See, contact for a person who is at a high risk of suicide and for a person who has actually attempted suicide, we have enough evidence that providing contact is extremely valuable in reducing the repeat suicide attempt and suicide in those who are at higher risk. We have worked in New South Wales. Actually, Greg Carter had sent postcards, just simple postcards to to people who have attempted suicide. And after 2 years, he found that those who received the postcard had lesser number of free admissions and lesser number of repeat attempts. And this was also done in Iran. And then we had the Supremes, which was done by the WHO in 5 different, in Bogota, in Sri Lanka, in India, China, Vietnam, 5 the low middle income countries, where the intervention was for those who have attempted suicide for 18 months, 9 contacts, either by visits or by telephones, not by very, very qualified people. Just a 3-minute intervention of how are they, do they need any help, how are they feeling suicidal, do they need to be referred somewhere, something very basic. And that has shown that suicide mortality was much reduced in those who have been contacted rather than those who have not been contacted. So we said we will train the community people, the community volunteers, the peer who themselves are living in refugee camps, and train them to offer some brief emotional support and meet all those high-risk people once in 15 days. And every month, the NGO SNEHA, which I run with volunteers who have been experienced in suicide prevention for 30 years, every month we will visit them for any clarifications, doubt, troubleshoot, give them advice, monitor, evaluate, and things like that. So then the next thing is what is known as safety planning. I'm sure majority of you in the US would know what the safety planning cards are. These have been started actually in the US in the Veterans Administration Hospital by Barbara Stanley. So these are it's a simple card which majority of the veterans who are at a high risk of suicide or those who have suicidal ideation carry. Okay, so the principle is that there is a predetermined set of coping styles. There are 3 components to safety planning cards. One is a predetermined set of coping styles, then activation of social support, and 3 is the help-seeking behavior, improving the help-seeking behavior. So actually, this is a kind of card which we made for our people. It follows the 6 steps. What it is it's a kind of the first step is it's a personalized, individualized card. Each person has their own card, own set of things. For example, the first step is identify when you have a low mood or a depressed mood. So for each person it may be different. So you write down those moods or feelings or whatever it is. Okay, and then the first step is when you are having this. Okay, what are the thoughts which comes to you? Normally people will say, I'm a failure, I'm no use, I'm a burden, or something like that. So the first step is to be aware of when these thoughts come. Okay, so you write down, okay, whenever you feel low, what are the kind of thoughts which comes into your mind? Most of them will say something like this: I'm a burden, I'm useless, I'll never succeed, I'm a failure, something like that. So you just put down all those things which comes into their mind. And the first thing is, okay, the second step is, okay, whenever you're feeling low, what are the kind of internal coping strategies which you do normally to make yourself feel better? It may be different for different people. Somebody may say walking, somebody may say dancing, somebody may say prayers, whatever it is. So whatever is particular to them, we write it down there. Okay. The third step is, even after doing that, you don't feel better, you still feel low, then what are the social things which will make you feel better? If people may say, I like going to my friend's house, or going to the movies, or going to a restaurant, or having a burger, or having a pizza, or whatever it is. So we write down exactly what that is for them, for each person. It is that social activation. You don't have to tell them that you are feeling depressed or suicidal. No, some social situation which makes you feel better. And even after that, you don't feel better. Then the next stage is, you have the list of that particular person's friends, relatives, cousins, aunts, whoever it is, to whom they can go and say, I am feeling low, I am feeling depressed because of this, I lost my job and I'm feeling terrible, or something like that. So that they are somebody who you can help and things like that. Okay. Then even if that doesn't help, then we say, okay, then what are the professional agencies which you can go? Okay. Like, do you have a hospital nearby? Do you have a hotline nearby? We give the name of the doctor, and we tell them, you talk to the doctor before. If I'm in situation, is it okay for me to call you, like that? So you have that particular person's name, phone number, contact number, things like that. And the last one is, if all that doesn't help you, and if you are still feeling extremely suicidal, then we ask you, we distance the means. Do you have the pills with you? Do you have the gun with you? Do you have the, can you give it to somebody else for safekeeping sometime, so that you buy time? And then finally, we say the last situation is, if nothing else helps, just go to the emergency department of the nearest hospital. So this it focuses on, as I said, improving your internal coping skills, activating social support, and also improve the help-seeking behavior, so that suicides are reduced. And this has been very nicely done in majority of the emergency department in the US. And they have shown that this safety planning cards has a significant reduction in the suicide attempts and suicide. And many of the veterans feel very comfortable having this. And even I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but I think this had more value for the men than for women. The men felt that they were more in control, and they were able to activate it, and feel better having it. There was a slight betterment. So as I said, identify these 288 and 187 as the high risk people, and these were the ones who were contacted once in 15 days and given the safety planning card. At the end of 1 year, we did the inline assessment of the group. Okay. So to give you a small picture of the demographic data between the camp, you can find that the age is more or less similar, the gender is more or less similar, but the intervention camp, the educational status was a little less. It was not, they were not as educated as the control camp. And then we did the suicidal ideation, depressive symptoms, PTSD symptoms, and you will find that most of them had alcohol use disorder. So people were asking me, we were not doing the major issue here. The only thing is, we did not find a simple, effective intervention which could be delivered by the community volunteers to reduce alcohol use disorder. So, and it would mean we have to cover the entire population. So we kind of left it. But you can see that The intervention camp had more people were more depressed and had clinically significant PTSD than the control camp. We wish we had done in more camps for us to understand this, but unfortunately we are not able to. Then we looked at whether there is any difference in the trauma. See, we classified trauma into two during the time when they were at the time of war, whether they had lost somebody, whether got separated from somebody, and was it a first degree relative? Okay. And whether the same thing happened during the migration. So we developed a score for the kind of trauma which they faced. And then we identified that there were 70 people in the refugee camp who had already made a suicide attempt. And we looked at was there a difference between male and female? No. But there was a slight difference in the marital status in the sense that there were more married people in those who had attempted suicide. And then if you look at the educational qualification, yeah, you will find that there is not much of a difference between those who have attempted suicide before and those who have not attempted suicide. Nor was there a change in the type of work which they were doing. So, but when you looked at the psychological variables, there was a significant difference between those who have attempted suicide before and those who have not. In that, those who have attempted suicide even currently had depressive symptoms and PTSD symptoms. But surprisingly, suicidal ideation, there was not much difference between the two groups. So what was the final outcome? If you look at the outcome, you'll find that when you combine both suicide and attempted suicide, in the intervention group, the previous 1 year, there were 13. But after the intervention, there were only 6. The change percent was quite statistically significant. But if you look at the people who have died by suicide, there were 4 at baseline and 1 at follow-up. The number was a little too small to be statistically significant. But the attempted suicide, there was a significant difference. So if you actually add both suicide and attempted suicide together, definitely this very small intervention has reduced suicidal behavior in the refugee camp. Unfortunately, we had to we wanted to actually do this for 2 years, so that will give us some amount of time to work on, do that. But unfortunately, what happened was at the end of 1 year, a person belonging to a terror group found sanctuary there and in the refugee camp, and so we were asked to move out quickly. So we had to abruptly stop that. So that caused some amount of tension because between the authorities and us, and we have these community volunteers. They were paid a measly sum of about $10 a month or something, just for them to motivate them. And I forgot to tell you about the kind of training we gave for them. So the training consists of mainly 3 things. One is how to empathetically listen to a person who is in distress. Number 2 is how to ask the question about suicide. and how to evaluate the imminent risk of suicide. And third is how best to refer them to the mental health professionals. And we had problems everywhere because we found that getting them to mental health professionals was a huge challenge. Though we have what is known as a district mental health program, where there is a psychiatrist sitting maybe just 5 kilometers away, she said she wanted these refugees to be brought there and see. And then she will prescribe medication, which they cannot afford, and neither can. So we have to engage the services of a couple of psychiatrists who are willing to give their time. So we arranged for them to come to the camp, and then we source from other people some medication which was when it was required. So all these required a lot of coming and going. And suddenly, see, for example, before I go to the camp, there is something called as a Q branch, which monitors every activity of the center. So I had to be grilled by the Q branch, which is like your FBI or something. And I had to notify them for every visit I have to go. So suddenly at the end of 1 year, they said this, you can't stay here anymore, you know. So many of you are coming and going. So we just had to stop it. So we had to train our community volunteers to tell them that we cannot give them this $10 a month subsidy anymore. Thank them for whatever they have done. And the surprising thing was what they were saying is, but how can we leave all these people alone? They have grown so close to us and they have started shining and they're being better. Generally, there is a, their status in the community also had risen and people are coming to us for help. So what shall we do? So these are all the tricky questions which we had to answer and find. And anyway, it's now 2 years since we stopped it, but now the government is kind of willing and said, look, if you want to restart it, you can restart it. So again, I have started searching for funds, and because I'm sure you all know how hard it is to get funds to do suicide prevention intervention in a refugee camp in a low middle income countries, because authorities are not really geared for that. Anyway, so this is what shall I say? This is a roadmap of our, I don't know what to call it, but this is what I feel can prevent suicide among the refugees and refugees camp. For example, what the health systems can do, what the community can do, what the relationships, what the individual can do. For example, for example, we know that majority do longer stay in detention centers. Deportation is when they have maximum suicides. So what we can do is, we can have counseling before they are repatriated. And language, see, the two major things which we have found is, as soon as you equip them with the language of the country which they are there, they feel so much better. And to maintain the network of the refugees, because when they are they are, for example, even in Tamil Nadu, fortunately the language issue is not there, because we are in Tamil Nadu and we speak the same language for the Tamil refugees. But you will find the father in one camp, children in another camp, things like that. So to keep the family together and to keep give them an economic freedom and language, that improves the self-esteem of the refugees. So these are all the risk factors. On the left, what you see in the blue and the gray are all the risk factors which are associated with the suicide among the refugees. And the the possible interventions we can have to address this. Okay, for example, the media, we have to have a media workshop, because majority of the media portray the refugees as burden on the society or in a negative way. So how can the media portray the refugees in a positive framework? Okay, and as I said, early education, the use, language and culture of the host country and early provision of economic activity is important. But also making sure that there is communication between the family and friends and the NGOs. These are some of the interventions which we think would be, which is important, because how do I say, as I said in the first slide, 51% of the refugees are children below the age of 18. And we know that 30% of people who have attempted suicide when they are in adolescence or in adult years have been exposed to violence and trauma very young. So if you look at it, 52% is about 12 million refugees. And 30% of 12 million refugees is we have at least 4 million children who are potentially suicidal. That is the magnitude of the problem, and for which I think we are just ignoring it. Gandhiji said there are 7 social sins. One is wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, and science without humanity. And I think if we continue to ignore the suicide among the refugees, we'll be really making a mockery of our humanity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that great presentation.
Not at all. I hope I didn't overshoot the time.
No. We're doing great. We have time for a Q&A to follow.
Yeah, sure.
So anybody who's joining us online, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. And if you have any issues with your microphone, you can also submit a question via the chat feature.
This is Teresa Betancourt calling in. I want to thank Lakshmi for an amazing presentation. It was so relevant to our work with Bhutanese refugees. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on taking all this thoughtful work you did in a low resource setting and what the implications are for adapting it to the situation of resettled refugees in higher income countries who may live in cities. Are there ways in which we can build off of these lessons learned and these methods? I really like the safety planning cards, and I was wondering if there are examples of doing this with populations where we know there's elevated risk of suicide in higher income countries where there's refugee resettlement.
Yeah, actually, if you ask me, the safety planning cards actually started in the US amongst the veterans. So there are actually majority of the evidence come from the US, where they have given the safety planning cards to high-risk individuals. And so even I am sure if you can use it in veterans who are dispersed all over, you can use it in the refugees also who are dispersed around the country. Because I think it would probably be helpful, because it gives the refugees a sense of control, that I am controlling, I have some kind of control, because majority of them feel that they don't have control. And this is a shift which makes them feel, okay, I can handle this. So a sense of control is what makes them more open to improve the social activities and help-seeking behavior. So actually there is quite a bit of evidence coming from the US on the use of safety planning cards. Initially, it was mostly only in the veterans admin hospitals for people who have been who are considered at high risk of suicide. Then they have actually started using it as a regular feature in the emergency care department. Okay, so instead of they do it as a matter of routine, and it was done in 5 hospitals, I think, in the US, and that was, I think, published last year in JAMA, or I'm not sure. I can look up at the reference, which shows that in all these hospitals, in the emergency department, when safety planning cards was administered by the nurse, the number of repeats and suicide, or the number of times when they are suicidal, they contacted for help, was significant.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really worth exploring. I think the workforce issues of how you sustain it and fund it, because with your experience, you've still had to go out and get funding because the state hasn't taken it up yet. Do you think there's the potential in India to even get state support to finance this preventative work?
See, I feel the fact is, in Tamil Nadu, I tried raising funds. I'm able to get funds from other NGOs and other trusts, but not governmental funding. And the next group of refugees are some of the refugees who have come over from Myanmar, from Bangladesh to the western part of the eastern part of India. And I have issues because I live far south and they are in the far northeast. So, but we are hoping that if we have enough funds, see, we have done it in only one intervention camp. There are 20 such camps in Tamil Nadu. So we hope we'll be able to expand if we get the right kind of funding.
Right, great. Are there other questions?
I have a quick question. Thank you so much, Lakshmi. That was great. You shared a little bit about the training that the community volunteers got. I'm curious a little bit about their background. Had they had similar experiences with trauma? I know you shared that, I mean, they all speak Tamil, but are they from sort of a similar cultural, and have they had similar experiences with trauma? And do you think that's important if you were to adapt this intervention in other places?
I think so, because they were all people who they are themselves refugees living there. They are living in the refugee camps. So they have been through this and they are part of the community. So what we did was we told them we want community volunteers, and many people applied. But then we were careful about selecting whom we want, because we wanted somebody who is empathetic, non-judgmental, who not who had the listening skills. And of course, that also caused a problem, because we had to reject one person. And so she went and she kind of controlled the vegetable shop and the milk shop and the petty shop there. So she told everybody, don't go and volunteer there. Okay. So from an entire group of row of people, we could even assess them. So it is, I think it works better if it is done by the refugees themselves, and we stay behind and support them.
Related to that, I am wondering what kind of supports, because I imagine that a lot of the stories that they might be hearing might be difficult, and I'm wondering, did you find that you needed to support them in order to be able to process some of the stories that they were hearing and really continue to engage with the groups effectively? Yeah, as I said, the community volunteers are all people who themselves have been in the camp. You're talking only about the Tibetan, or I don't know what. The participants who were the visitors, I'm wondering, because they had their own histories of trauma.
Yeah.
you
So
know,
it-
what kind of support?
Yes, yes. So what we found interesting was that the group of 10 volunteers whom we have trained, they bonded together so well. You know, they formed the network for themselves, okay? And so if, for example, if they had difficulty in contacting a particular person, okay, then the other person would, in the network would help. So they met every week and they formed lasting friendships and relationships with them. And then that formed a support. And if, of course, sometimes it rekindles their own, for example, I remember the one girl who has been contacting a person once in 15 days. At the end of seventh month, that guy went and died by suicide. Okay, she felt extremely broken, distraught, and felt what have I done anything wrong? I should have done this. I should have done that. You know, why did this? He didn't even tell me. I thought we had a real, you know, we were open and things like that. So she went through a terrible situation, and the other volunteers rallied, and as NGO, I told you, every month we used to go for mentoring and troubleshooting. So a couple of our volunteers went and spent a couple of days with her, asked her to take a break for a month, and you know, feel better about doing it. And then after a break of a month, we again talked to her to find out whether she was still emotionally stable to go through with the other people. So till that time, somebody else did the contacts of her people.
Okay.
So at the end of 1 month, we again assessed to find out whether she was emotionally stable enough to start the contacts with her other clients.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I'd love to thank you so much for presenting today. I think that we all learned a lot. And if anybody has any additional questions, they can always follow up on email. We did record the presentation today, and so we can always share that with anybody who wasn't able to attend. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Sarah, because Teresa started the thing and Sarah pulled it together, and I hope it was useful 1 hour for you. It was a very nice experience for me to share it with you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.